He opened the door for so many people. Enough can't be said about Howard's contribution to Canadian crime fiction.
To create an enduring character is everything that a writer tries to do. Benny Cooperman, he's a character who will stand the test of time. A truly Canadian creation.
Howard Engel is one of the best liked people in the literary community, in part because there's no pretense to him.
Gone through an extraordinary series of mishaps that would have flattened anybody else, I think.
It takes time, but every time you... When she reached 281, she stopped. Too many she's, she. My name is Howard Engel. I write detective stories. That's what I tell people when they ask me what I do. I could say I'm a writer and novelist, but that raises a false echo in my brain. So I'm happier with the more modest claim of writing detective stories.
The thing about Howard Engel is he never gives up.
I'd like to see your name like Motherwood or Do Good.
When he had a stroke, he just went about figuring out a way that would enable him to carry on as a writer. And that's what I really admire about him. He just doesn't give up. He just gets up every morning and keeps at it and keeps going.
Great. Well, lovely to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Bye now.
Bye.
A lesser person would have just folded up his desk and gone away. It's a great act of will for Howard to write, and it's very difficult. And I think it's really a testament to his courage and his passion for what he does.
I didn't know at the time that he was a writer. I was just told that he had some kind of communication problem. And the routine assessment involves having someone write a description of a standard picture. And what was so unique about this situation was Mr. Engel wrote a description of a picture that I've had hundreds of people do for me, but it was the most descriptive and eloquent description of that picture I had ever read. And when I had asked him if he knew how well it was written, he told me that he wasn't able to read what he had written.
I never arrived in Toronto without feeling like I was some rube off the farm, come to sell my goats at the market. I let the phallic CN Tower lead me into town, wondering as I drove up Spadina Avenue how it was that most cities are female except Toronto. Chicago, New York, Paris are the experienced old whores who know all about breaking in a new stud. Toronto somehow missed that cue and doesn't know where to get a sex change at this late date.
Engel's chief contribution to Canadian crime writer has been his character, Benny Cooperman, the creation of that character. And it's the only distinctive, truly Canadian sleuth, in my view, that there is. He is unique. He is a sui generis.
Yes. Martha Tracy, please.
I always see him as a cross between Leopold Bloom and Columbo.
Yes, I wonder if you would let me have her home phone number, please.
That Jewish zeitgeist and that sort of slightly worn, grubby raincoat kind of feel about him. And he was a character. I mean, that in the right sense of the word.
Enough can't be said about Howard's contribution to Canadian crime fiction. In 1979, 1980, when he was writing Benny Cooperman, it was an article of faith that if you set a novel, particularly a crime novel in Canada, it was doomed. I mean, you couldn't possibly put it in Canada. You also had to ape the Americans or the Brits. And Howard chose not to. He chose to create a significantly Canadian character, someone based on very much himself. And in doing so, he opened the door for a whole range of writers who said, no, we don't have to restructure our plots. We don't have to pretend that Toronto is Chicago. We can have mystery novels that are set here that talk about the things that interest us.
We don't have that strain of vigilantism in Canada. Dirty Harry is looking for work in Toronto, putting in time until the streets get meaner. He may not have to wait long, but in the interval, the traditions aren't the same. Canadians are bigger consumers of law and order for one thing. Not spitting on the sidewalk or shooting the pigeons in the park is a sensible way to behave. A small enough price to pay for being allowed to stand aside from the mainstream of North American life.
You know, somebody said, well, do you particularly try to dress up your character so he's a particularly Canadian hero? Well, you don't do things like that. That would look like fancy dress. You just, I'm the writer and I must be Canadian enough. That should do to solve the problem.
Both Howard and people like Bunny Wright and Eric Wright were adamant in making sure that their novels were Canadian content. They talk about Stanfields, they talk about loonies, they make references to Prime Minister Trudeau, and they don't explain themselves. They don't try and make it some amorphous Midwestern city that will sell better to the Americans.
Down Bloor Street. My father had a ladies' ready-to-wear store on the main street in St. Catharines. But St. Catharines was new to him. He moved there the year I was born. It was a business opportunity and he took advantage of it and opened the store without changing the name of the former occupant. So Edwards Women's Wear sent 2 kids through university, and we never did know who Edward was. My mother was all those wonderful things mothers are. She started me from the earliest Mother Goose stories to the reading of the tales of Robin Hood and the members of the Round Table and King Arthur, and through Mark Twain and into other things.
My grandmother encouraged the love of books and film and theater early in his life, and being creative was just a logical next step. And so everything he's done has been creative in some way.
I was a bit of a dreamer. I made marionettes as a kid and put on a puppet show. My brother helped out, and so did a few of the neighbor kids. That's how I got into writing, really, because once you had the noses painted on the puppets and the hair glued on, the next thing you had to do was find them something to say. I went off to university at McMaster in Hamilton, Ontario. But I don't think my academic career was particularly distinguished. I mean, I got all my grades and managed to scrape through. But there were a few knobs of interest that attracted me, and one of them was the Board of Publications. The people who hung around the Board of Publications were a bit of a gang. And Marian Passmore, at that time, was one of these people. She wrote a column. My only claim to fame was I invented a copy ruler, which was so that you could go directly from writing copy on a typewriter to knowing how many column inches it would fill. Scarcely a literary claim, but there it is. One thing I wanted to do was to go to Europe. And so I started out living in London, working out of the CBC office.
But to Howie Engel, it presented a different sort of challenge. What was your connection, Howie, with My Fair Lady in New York?
I was a professional scalper for a whole month. Well, we bought them for about $3.45, as closely as I can remember, and I sold one for $50 once.
And then I went off to Paris, where my bad French got a little better, and I managed to stay alive there, doing small items and small documentaries for CBC Radio. Somewhere in all of this tangled mess of city hopping, Paris, London, and Rome, I ran into my old university friend, Marian Passmore, and we were married in London. We came back to Toronto. I went back to work for Harry Boyle at the CBC, and Marian had just began publishing fiction. And her first novel was very well received, and she began publishing novels regularly thereafter, while we were bringing up kids in rented apartments. At the CBC, I became the executive producer of a program called Anthology. We talked to new writers and new poets and publishers and people around in the writing game, and I began to feel as though I was a eunuch in the harem, because I saw the trick done all the time, but I wasn't doing it myself. And gradually I started trying to write a few short stories and wrote a few poems. That was the beginning of my serious writing. Marian was a perfectionist as a writer. I watched her throw away more pages, big, thick chunks of work that had taken weeks. She drove herself very hard.
I've got manuscripts in the basement that have, you know, the novel starting the same sentence over and over and over again, but slightly worded differently. So, and none of that ended up in the end product.
I never had the feeling that Marian was making heavy waves of writing, that she was making it harder than it had to be. You know, there may be 6 or 7 ways across a swamp, but you have to wade there yourself.
As individuals, they wanted their own careers and their own lives, and they kept knocking heads.
Hugh McLennan told Marian at one time that you can't have 2 writers under the same roof. And I think she believed that. I'm not sure that Hugh McLennan believed it.
It was sort of a classic sort of 70s situation where, you know, women were, you know, emphasizing their own rights and their careers, and less being housewives. And, you know, at some point she just decided she wasn't interested in looking after him and his life, and she really wanted to look after her own life.
Marian was now a very popular writer. She was no longer a beginning writer. She had, some of her books had become very well known, and perhaps I was cramping her style. When the marriage collapsed, I was alone for a while, and on my own, and I guess out of it, within a couple of years came my first published writing. When I started to write what became The Suicide Murders, the first of the Benny Cooperman books, I thought, let's make a detective who is not like any of the others. He comes from a small town, not from a big city. He's Canadian, not American or British. He's Jewish and not Christian. And I thought by reversing it, I would get something like a character who would be unusual. But it was a kind of mechanical mixture, I thought. Except that the first time I started writing in his voice, the voice was his voice.
Funerals make me nervous. I don't care whose they are. I watched them bury Churchill and Kennedy and Martin Luther King and the other Kennedy on television, where you could see that even when you're dead, it helps to have money to bring the right tone and taste to the send-off. I skipped the church service. That's another thing that gives me the willies. Ever since I was a kid, churches and me have kept our distance from one another. I kept thinking that because of my religion, they might have to have the place reconsecrated or something.
If you think of Benny Cooperman as a quintessential Canadian private eye, he's kind, he's from a small town, he's a very sweet person, he's unarmed of course, and he's very resourceful, but in a very nice kind of way.
A kind of Jewish, small city Jewish sleuth who was tied to his mother's apron strings, who was queasy at the sight of blood and so on. A kind of almost, somebody who was being pressured by his parents to leave this detective business and join the ready-to-wear business and so on.
That tickled my fancy as a character, somebody who was sort of backing into the limelight and shy about what he did and not boasting. And working in a small town gave him a chance to, he'd be following a character and people would say, "Hi, Benny," as he walked by. I mean, now you can't imagine that happening to Sam Spade or Philip Marlowe.
No one thinks of Benny Cooperman going out and beating somebody half to death to get the information out of him. And in that sense, he's an amalgam of the Brits and the Americans. He's not violent, but he's also not as cerebral as the Brits. So he's somewhere in between, which is probably where Canadians are as well.
I grew up in St. Catharines, and I modeled the town that Benny lived and worked in after this city. The city has grown, and that's why I live in the Grantham of my imagination, because I can keep things static. I don't have to wait for the builders. As far as I knew, there'd never been a mystery set in a small town, and I thought there are just as many things going on under the counter in a small town as in a big city. And so I thought that the fun of writing about Benny would be to discover the things that went on in the back of the shop and in closed rooms, the small groups that would get together. This corner, the corner of St. Paul and James, downtown St. Catharines, is really the center of my father's universe. Here's where he opened his store, Edwards Women's Wear. Down there he parked his car. This was where I used to come for my allowance on a Saturday afternoon before going to see a double bill at the Granada Theater down James Street.
What I needed to do was relax with a good department store catalog to get my priorities unscrambled. Only a one-holer, and the plumbing's out of order.
Some people like blood. They want plenty of corpses. Well, Howard can supply corpses, but he doesn't have a detective who goes around knocking people out with one swift blow or anything, like Mike Hammer. But I don't know who he's like in the States, but as a good writer, he resembles people like Elmore Leonard.
When the suicide murders appeared, my family were overjoyed. Here was a writer in the house, and it sort of changed the weight of balance in the kitchen when I started asking for coffee in the morning. But beyond that, not much changed.
My mother actually snuck out and bought the Suicide Murders, or perhaps my brother and I might have brought one home, but she was very proud of him, and she really, they were very good friends for a really long time, and she was supportive and actually quite pleased with, she was a huge mystery fan. When she was reading, a lot of the time it was mystery, so yeah, she really enjoyed his work, but it takes a lot of pride to tell someone that, especially when you're in the middle of a nasty divorce.
The critical success of the book was another matter. It got very, very fine reviews, and it was seen as the first true Canadian mystery novel. Now that's not true, and I never made that claim, but people did say that it was the very first. And Hugh Garner had done mystery novels before me, and there were others too. But this seemed to spark a lot of activity in the mystery genre. A lot of people started writing them after me, and now there are a lot of members of the Crime Writers of Canada.
Howard and I and a group of others started the Crime Writers of Canada. That was in 1982. We used to get together in a pub, and it was all very fraternal, and we used to give each other prizes. There was a big dinner every year, which was the highlight of our year.
I met Howard in the early 80s at one of the first Canadian crime writers meetings that I went to, and Howard was one of the main members at the time. There weren't many Canadian crime writers back in the early 80s, and Howard was one that sort of welcomed everyone who was new to the fold.
Canadian crime writers are taken seriously everywhere now. And that's in 27 years, and that's not a very long time. Not at all. And Howard was there opening those doors.
Did I think that there would be a career for Benny Cooperman? I didn't. I thought that maybe this book was just it. That was the only one. But while the first book was going around, and after I'd heard that it had sold, I decided, well, I better see whether I can do it again. And that book went very well and very quickly, and so did the third and the fourth. And pretty soon I discovered that I had to think of myself as a writer. It wasn't just something I was doing after dinner. Working from book to book, I tried to get Benny into as much trouble as I could. What trouble I dished out for him was something for him to overcome, and the more difficulty I could find, the better book I think came out of it.
My trouble with detective stories and mystery novels is I can never follow the plot. I don't care how good they are. I'm absolutely mystified by the plot. And Howard's got that kind of mind where he can go through all those twists and come out with it at the end and be convincing about the solution of the crime.
Now Kathy writes, and Kathy writes, takes a body apart in every book, and explains what the bits are, and writes very well too. But it's clear that the public wants
more of this bloody stuff.
More of this,
You know, how you tell the difference between a suicide attempt as cutting his throat and a real cut throat. You know, suicides always make a couple of false attempts before they actually cut the throat.
See, so we can now commit the perfect crime. We just have to do a couple of false starts.
Another thread that runs through all the books is the fact that Benny gets better at his job, and he also attracts a different class of clientele. At the beginning, he does a job for the janitor who looks after his office. That's in one of the early books. In another, later on, he does a job for a gangster who thinks somebody's trying to kill him. So as his track record gets better and better, the complications of the kinds of jobs he finds for himself are more interesting and I think more compelling to the reader.
She'd allowed her dressing gown to fall open both at the neck and again lower down, so there was a fair amount of Vanessa on display, and in the most beguiling way. I decided that what she wanted was a hug. Where's the disloyalty in that? It was the least I could do.
Benny Cooperman over the years has become more confident and more assured, but the outlines of his character are still the same. And also the fact that he brings into this crime writing a kind of comic, droll aspect.
It was, as I said on my way in, all part of the service. While I was still seeing myself in terms of the steadfast little sentry at the door, the hug developed into something more serious. And the brave sentry, well, could hardly abandon his musket at a time like this.
Benny Cooperman is so ordinary that if he didn't have humor, he would be boring. But he has humor and he's not. He's a terrific character simply because he's so verbally alive. I mean, Benny's wonderful to read about, to chuckle with, to go along with. But he has no extraordinary characteristics at all. I mean, he's a schmo, you know, or schmuck, or what's the word I'm looking for, you know. He's a chopped egg sandwich, eating, Jewish, lousy, well, quite a good detective, but not very successful in terms, but he's funny. And that's, I think, where his strength lies.
I carried my trophy catch lake trout back to my cabin at Petawawa Lodge. It would have been nice if there'd been a crowd on the dock to greet me, but everybody was battened down safe, dry, and out of sight. Oh, well, you lose some and you lose some.
Spend so much time with a book nowadays that it really has to be Gone with the Wind or something better than that before I spend any time on it. You know, War and Peace would take me from here to eternity.
Well, I think everybody, when they reach a certain age, reads mysteries. I know W.B. Yeats used to read 4 a week.
When I first started writing crime fiction, I just read some Dashiell Hammett and some Raymond Chandler, and I thought these books are good books as books, not just because there's a murderer at the end, but they stand up as fiction, and that was that's what got me going, and I still stand by that.
Crime writers are considered commercial fiction. They are secondary writers. They're not considered major writers, which is ridiculous, quite frankly. I'll put some of their writing up against the best this country has to offer, the best any country has to offer.
Yeah, but there's somebody watching her. Where is she? He's watching from, where is he? He's at the curb. Some people are always playing social games, and they put a color bar between crime fiction and straight fiction. And I've always tried to fight that whenever I could.
Benny and I are like in some ways, and we're different in other ways. He's a tidier by nature. I mean, that's why he's in the detective business. He likes to clean up the messes in people's lives. And I'm not by nature a tidier. I tend to create messes.
Get away from me. Away from me.
Benny is an everyman. Benny is very much like Howard Engel, just a man who stumbles into different situations and then uses his wiles to figure his way out of them.
We weren't a very athletic family.
This looks like I've never done it before, which is the dead truth.
When we were kids, we dragged him out to play Frisbee. And I think within 10 minutes of that, he threw his back out. And that was an example of, you know, we were definitely a more cerebral family where we would go to movies together or read books. It was never, you know, very athletic. comic, but he did, I believe, put his back out and used his limp to ask my stepmother out eventually, so it all worked out in the end.
Janet came in through the CBC door. She was working in the drama department. She was a script assistant and secretary. She was very good for me. She encouraged my work. She got me to relax about myself and maintain perspective at all times. Janet was a writer. She published a novel. Together we did a couple of things. Most of them were funny things, like somebody wanted a television script expanded into a novel. So we did that together under a pseudonym. We wrote under the name of FX Wolf. We thought that people would think that the F was Francis and the X would naturally be Xavier, but we decided it would be Xerxes. So we thought we might pick up a bit of money in cheap bets.
I belong to a lunch club, and Howard is a member of that lunch club.
They like to get together as friends and debate issues of the day and talk about books and talk about a lot of other things. Movies very often. They've been having lunch on a Friday afternoon for the last 30 years or more.
One time, a few years ago, there was a game we played at this lunch. Everyone was asked to mention a hero. And I remember what Howard did was he mentioned the hero for him was his wife Janet. And she was struggling with brain cancer at the time. It was such a quiet but elegant testimony, and so eloquent too, to his wife. And I was very touched by that.
Janet had a couple of blackouts. Once we were watching television and she just fainted and didn't come around for a while. The second time it happened when she had taken Jacob to the park, and Jacob was the hero of the occasion. He called, got an ambulance to come. She had just fainted in the sand pile where she was playing with Jacob. And for a while it appeared to be something fairly minor, but later it was diagnosed as a brain tumor. And it was operated on twice in a year. And then it was found to be inoperable when it reoccurred for the third time.
I don't know that one's ever old enough for a death as close to the bosom of the family, as it were. And Jacob and I were greatly affected by it. It opened up a gap in our lives that's really never been filled.
What happened today, Jacob?
What did we do? History class. Gretchen's going to come in, my old economics teacher, and she's doing a guest thing on World War I.
Jacob got busy burying himself in school. They were very close, Jacob and Janet. It was a relationship that had a great deal of affection and intellectual life to it.
One day I'll...
And then I got busy burying myself in work because it was a place to go from the grief.
He's gone through an extraordinary series of mishaps that would have flattened anybody else, I think. But he just sat there until eventually the tide, pain and the rest of it receded, and he was still writing. So I'm all admiration for him.
It was a day like any other day. I got up, brushed my teeth, I guess, and went downstairs and probably put the kettle on for tea or started coffee going. Went out, collected the newspaper from the front porch, all the simple, ordinary things, and then I opened up the newspaper and looked at the headlines, and they seemed to be written in Russian or Serbo-Croatian or Chinese, or I couldn't tell what. And I thought, I must be a victim of a practical joke.
I got a phone call from my little brother saying, look, Dad's had a stroke. Of course, I dropped everything and went straight down to the hospital, and he, had had a stroke. He was in emergency at Mount Sinai, and the doctors, had him plugged up to tubes.
My son was able to come to my aid at almost every time I was asked a question. I couldn't remember my name. I couldn't remember what day it was, who was the prime minister. All the normal questions that were asked at admitting failed me. I couldn't think of anything. And it didn't seem particularly strange either that I shouldn't remember the prime minister's name. But all of the important pieces of information were added by Jacob, who saw me through those early stages.
He was in pretty good spirits, considering he had had a stroke, and his friend from summer camp was 3 beds away. It was hilarious, Jewish geography. It was like, Morty, is that you? Howie, is that you?
Further examination over the next little while, they found out that I had something called alexia sine agraphia, which means that I could write, but I could no longer read. It was really laid in my heart not being able to read, feeling myself cut off from Hawthorne and Whitman and Poe and Wordsworth and Shakespeare. It was incredible, and I decided I couldn't live with that, so I went back and I kept on reading, even if it was just a word at a time.
Usually people, if they have communication problems, have difficulty talking and understanding, as well as difficulty with reading and writing. But in Mr. Engel, it was just the reading. And so he was really able to describe to me what kind of thinking processes he was going through as he was looking at these words that didn't make sense to him.
I'm still a slow reader. I still work my way through the pages. I still use techniques to find my place if I've lost it. I find that I can pick out the part of a sentence where I was interrupted much quicker now than before.
It's a horrible sickness, isn't it?
What did you do before you got sick?
I was retired, You
were retired?
I couldn't even imagine how terrible it is, to lose the ability to read for someone like Howard, who's just, a very learned and very literate person. Reading has been his entire life. So it doesn't surprise me in a way that he's got it back. He had to get it back. He had to work at it. It's absolutely astonishing that somebody, for example, can lose the ability to read but can still write.
How's the food?
That's hospital food,
Well, then you're getting better. It's time you moved out. But see, when I first came, I thought the food was wonderful. By the time I left, I thought it was terrible. Working my way through my stroke and the alexia that came about, it was hard to even think of writing. But the whole idea of using the experience, it just seemed axiomatic, because why would you throw away good material?
It was quite amazing because he'd be sitting in his hospital bed and he'd be writing down every single thing anyone would say. But of course he had no ability whatsoever to read it back. It took him quite a while to even get, the simplest vocabulary back for any kind of name, of any sort of noun.
I thought, well, let's see, we'll put Benny in the hospital. He'll solve a mystery from his hospital bed. And then the only work left for me is to figure out a story that would be interesting enough to create a book.
Look, Benny, you've been very lucky. Lots of people up here are much worse off than you. Damn it, Sam, I'm not trying to win a disability contest. When they found you, you were in very bad shape. You'd lost a lot of blood from your head wound, not from the brain itself. But the scalp and tissue around the area made it look as though you'd been shot in the head. You understand? Dr. Collins says that your immediate memory is in a shambles and that you're going to have some difficulty reading. You can write, but you can't read what you've written.
It took a lot longer than it normally took me to write a book. The material was no more difficult than any of the other mysteries. I had more fun doing it, perhaps, than some, but it did take longer. Everything took longer. Rereading, getting people to read sections to me, and getting a feel of the whole book as a literary construct. That was tough.
The thing about writing is that you have to be able to read what you've written, because that's when you see where the holes are. That's when you see, oh, I know, I meant to go here, I meant to go there. Well, those are the things that Howard can't do as easily as the rest of us now. So he has worked out strategies to compensate for that.
It was always the recapitulation, the going back, that was difficult, to make sure that you hadn't created a two-headed villain or given someone a character transplant in the midst of a novel, that someone who was all sweetness and light on page 40 became an arch villain on 97.
My favorite Howard Engel mystery would be Memory Book, which is the one that he wrote soon after he'd had his stroke. It's fascinating the way that he was able to piece together one of the hardest kinds of books to write without the complete memory that he had before, and I don't know how he managed to keep track of plot lines and characters and who was killing whom and who was dying when, but it's a fascinating piece of work.
It's a sort of an irony almost that his best book in terms of writing, comes at a time and out of a situation where, of course, he's lost the ability to read. I didn't know what to expect when I read Memory Book. And what I found was, first of all, that he maintained the integrity of the character. But the other thing was that he gave the character so much dimension by making him, again, someone who has the same affliction that Howard has. And the images of him desperately trying to recognize a word in that book, I think, are something that everyone who's read it remembers.
He just went about figuring out a way that would enable him to carry on as a writer. And what matters is that he keeps on writing.
Howard Engel is one of the best liked people in the literary community, in part because there's no pretense to him. His humor is unfailing, his sense of irony, and his friendliness and his personability, his amiability, which is genuine.
He's got a great warmth and a great sense of style, a great sense of humor. And as a human being, he's very much the same. It comes out in him when you meet him as a person. He's always been very encouraging to new writers, to younger writers. He's always been very open, very welcoming.
I took the phone and stood there in the middle of my sunny kitchen in the middle of wintertime in Edmonton and phoned him, and he answered. I thought I was going to leave a message or get a secretary or something like that. And we talked for about 45 minutes, and he had no idea who I was. All I said was, I'm Janice MacDonald, and I live in Edmonton, and I've written a mystery manuscript, and I'm not quite sure what to do with it. And he said, oh, let me tell you. And he went from there. He gave me wonderful advice.
I don't have a lot of ego invested in what I do. The work is the important thing, and I try to get on with that as well as I can. I'm a one-trick pony. I'm not good at learning to do other things. I didn't think of myself as a writer for a long time. I thought, well, I'm working on this book, but that doesn't make me a writer. Maybe at some level I'm still doing that, Somebody's going to pull the plug on me at some point, or somebody's going to say, you've no business here.
He broke new ground as the author of the Benny Cooperman mystery series, featuring heroes, villains, and locations that are unequivocally Canadian. Mr. Engel.
He's the first Canadian crime writer to receive the Order of Canada. He's the first Canadian crime writer to receive a major award. That was last year for Memory Book.
I think that he will always be seen as one of the founding fathers of Canadian mystery writing.
Wendy paused at the corner, looking up and down the street.
He has a kind of courage and resilience that is amazing. No matter what tragedy or loss that he's suffered, and he's suffered a great deal of loss in his life, there's some good nature there, a good humor, a balanced and good-hearted approach that never fails.
As far as she could tell, she had not been followed.
He doesn't sweat the small stuff, and I think that is his strength. He's had a lot of horrible things happen to him, and he's just amazing. He just keeps going. A lot of admiration for him because of that.
And opened the front door, which, as she suspected, was still open, still unlocked. Is it still unlocked?